Emily stood at the bottom of the creaky wooden stairs, staring up into the darkness of her grandmother's attic. The musty smell drifted down like an old memory she couldn't quite place. Her heart felt heavy as lead in her chest. "I know it's hard, love," said her grandmother Rose, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. Her voice was soft and understanding. "But we need to sort through Grandfather William's things." Emily was 17 and had never felt so lost in her entire life. Her grandfather had been her best friend, her guide, her biggest supporter. He was the one person who truly understood her dreams of becoming a writer. He would sit with her for hours, listening to her stories and encouraging her to keep writing even when the words felt stuck. Now, he was gone, and Emily felt like part of her heart had been buried with him in the cold ground. The house felt too quiet without his gentle laughter echoing through the rooms. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick more slowly, as if time itself was mourning his loss. Emily had avoided coming upstairs since the funeral 3 weeks ago. Everything reminded her of him. They climbed the wooden stairs together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Each step creaked under their weight, making sounds that seemed too loud in the silence. Rose held the handrail tightly, moving slowly because of her arthritis. Emily wanted to help her, but didn't know how to offer without making her grandmother feel old. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through a small round window at the far end of the attic. The golden light made everything look magical, but Emily couldn't feel any magic today. Boxes and old furniture filled every corner of the space, holding decades of memories that felt too precious to disturb. There were William's old fishing rods, Rose's wedding dress in a white box, and stacks of books that smelled like vanilla and age. Emily picked up a medium-sized cardboard box marked William's papers in his careful handwriting. The box was heavier than she expected, and she carried it slowly to the window for a better light. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found old letters, newspaper clippings, and his reading glasses still folded neatly in there. Brown case dot as she moved the papers aside. Something leather-bound caught her eye. She pulled out an old photo album, its brown cover worn smooth by countless hands over many years. The leather felt soft and warm, like it had been loved and touched often. There were small scratches on the cover, and the corners were slightly bent from age. The moment Emily opened the album, that distinctive attic smell grew stronger. It was like old paper mixed with forgotten dreams and time itself. The smell made her feel sad and curious at the same time. She had never smelled anything quite like it before. The pages were filled with black and white photographs of people she had never seen before. The pictures were small and square with white borders, the kind people took long ago with old cameras. The faces looking back at her were kind, but carried a deep sadness in their eyes. Their clothes were simple but neat. The women wore long, dark dresses, and the men had serious expressions and formal suits. Grandmother Rose, Emily called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are these people?" Rose looked over from the box she was sorting through. When she saw the album in Emily's hands, she gasped loudly. Her wrinkled hands flew to her mouth, and tears immediately filled her tired blue eyes. She moved toward Emily as quickly as her old legs would carry her. "Oh, my dear child," Rose whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I thought this was lost forever. I looked for it after William passed, but I couldn't find it anywhere. These are your great-great-grandmother Margaret's family photos." Emily studied the faces more carefully, holding the album closer to the window light. Something about their eyes seemed familiar, like looking into mirrors from long ago. She could see traces of her own features in their faces, the same shaped nose, the same way of holding their heads slightly to one side. Margaret had 3 sisters, Rose continued, sitting down heavily on an old wooden chair. Her voice was shaking with memory and sorrow. Their names were Catherine, Helen, and Jane. They were separated during the war when Margaret was just 19 years old. It was a terrible time, and families were torn apart without warning. Rose paused to wipe her eyes with her handkerchief. Margaret came to England alone. Believing her sisters had died in the bombing, she had nothing except the clothes on her back and this precious album. But she kept their pictures close to her heart, hoping against hope that someday she might find them again. Emily felt a strange pull toward these unknown relatives. Their stories seemed to call out to her from across the years, begging to be told, and remembered. She could almost hear their voices whispering from the photographs. What happened to them? Emily asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. We never knew, Rose said sadly. Shaking her head, Margaret spent her whole life writing letters to refugee organizations, searching through records, and hoping for any news. This album was her most precious treasure. She would look at it every night before bed, talking to the pictures like. Her sisters could hear her. Emily held the album closer, breathing in its unique smell of hope mixed with sorrow. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything about her life. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious faces in Margaret's photo album. The old leather book had become like a magnet to her thoughts. Every morning before school, she would sit by her bedroom window with a cup of tea, turning the pages slowly and carefully. She studied each person as if they might suddenly speak to her and tell her their secrets. The morning light would shine on the black and white photographs, making the faces look almost alive. Emily would trace her finger around their features, wondering what their voices sounded like and what stories they could tell. She memorized every detail, the way one woman smiled with only one side of her mouth, how a man held his hat in his hands, the small children who looked scared but brave. You're becoming obsessed with those old pictures, her mother Helen said one morning over breakfast. She was buttering toast and watching Emily with worried eyes, but Emily could hear understanding in her voice, not criticism. Helen knew that Emily was trying to heal from losing her grandfather, and maybe this search was helping her find her way back to herself. Emily would rush home from school each day, grab a quick snack, and head straight to the local library. The old brick building had become her second home. She spent hours learning how to research family history on the computer. At first, the websites confused her with their complicated forms and endless lists of names. But slowly, she began to understand how to search for people who had lived long ago. She discovered websites about war refugees and immigration records. There were databases full of ship passenger lists and government documents. Each click of the computer mouse felt like opening a door to the past. Emily learned about the terrible war that had separated so many families and the brave people who had traveled across oceans looking for safety. The librarian, Mr. James, became a helpful guide through the maze of online databases. He was a patient man with kind eyes and grey hair who had helped many people research their family trees. He would sit beside Emily at the computer, showing her which websites were most reliable and how to spell names in different ways to find more results. Your great-great-grandmother was very brave, he told her one quiet afternoon as they searched through immigration records. Imagine leaving everything you know at such a young age. She must have been terrified, but also incredibly strong. Emily learned that Margaret had arrived in Liverpool in 1943 on a crowded ship full of refugees. She was only 19 years old and had nothing but a small brown suitcase and her precious photo album. The records showed that she had worked in a textile factory, making cloth for 12 hours a day and 6 days a week. She saved every penny she earned, sending money to refugee organizations and paying for newspaper advertisements hoping to find her sisters years later. Margaret had met and married Emily's great-great-grandfather Thomas. He was a kind dock worker, with strong hands and a gentle heart, who had helped her write letters to refugee organizations in 3 different languages. Together, they had spent decades searching for any trace of Catherine. Helen and Jane. She never gave up searching. Rose explained one evening as they sat together in the living room. The old woman's voice was full of admiration and sadness, even when she was old and sick. When her hands shook and her eyes were dim, she would ask me to help her write one more letter, make one more phone call. She believed until her last breath that her sisters might still be alive somewhere. Emily felt a deep connection growing between herself and this ancestor she had never met. Margaret's determination reminded Emily of her own dreams to become a writer. Those dreams had felt impossible since her grandfather's death, but now they seemed to stir back to life. Maybe writing Margaret's story could be her way back to her own words. The album smells like the attic because Margaret kept it hidden there for years, Rose continued. Rocking slowly in her chair, she was afraid to look at it too often because the memories were too painful. Each photograph would make her cry for hours, but she couldn't bear to throw it away. It was all she had left of her family. Emily understood that feeling completely. Sometimes love and pain were mixed together so tightly that you couldn't separate them. The album carried both Margaret's greatest joy and her deepest sorrow. That night, Emily made a decision that would change her life. She would continue Margaret's search. She would find their family, or at least try with all her heart. She felt like Margaret's spirit was calling to her across the years, asking her to finish what she had started. Emily carefully photographed each picture in the album with her phone. The camera flash lit up the old faces for just a moment, and she imagined she could see hope flickering in their eyes. The faces looked back at her through the camera lens, as if they were counting on her to succeed where Margaret had failed. She uploaded the photos to her computer and stared at them on the bright screen. Modern technology was meeting the past, and Emily felt like she was building a bridge between Margaret's world and her own. Emily didn't know how she would do it, but she felt Margaret's spirit guiding her every step. She could almost hear her great-great-grandmother's voice encouraging her to keep going. The story wasn't over yet, and Emily was going to make sure it had a better ending. Emily sat at a desk on a quiet Saturday morning, staring at her computer screen. Her hands shook slightly as she typed her first social media post. She had been thinking about this moment for days, but now that it was time to act, she felt nervous and scared. What if no one cared about her old family photos? What if she was wasting her time? She carefully uploaded the clearest photographs from Margaret's album, making sure each face could be seen properly. Then she wrote a simple message that came straight from her heart. Looking for a family separated during WWII. These people might be your relatives. Please share. She read the words 3 times before pressing the publish button. At first, absolutely nothing happened. Emily checked her phone every few minutes, hoping for replies or comments or anything that might give her hope. She refreshed the page over and over until her thumb was sore from swiping, but the silence felt deafening. Only 2 people had liked her post, and no one had shared it or left any comments. Be patient. Love, Rose advised when Emily complained about the lack of response. The old woman was knitting in her favorite chair, her needles clicking softly. Together, good things take time. Your great-great-grandmother waited her whole life. You can wait a little longer. But Emily wasn't feeling patient at all. She was 17 years old, and waiting felt impossible when she had such an important mission burning in her heart. School began to feel meaningless when she had real detective work to do. She would sit in math class thinking about search strategies instead of algebra. During English literature, She would plan which genealogy websites to check next instead of reading Shakespeare. Her grades began to slip as she spent every free moment researching genealogy websites and joining online groups for war survivors, families. She discovered forums where people shared stories about lost relatives and posted old photographs hoping someone would recognize a face. Emily spent hours reading these stories, and each one made her more determined to find Margaret's sisters. Her best friend Lucy grew worried about Emily's new obsession. They had been friends since elementary school, and Lucy could see that Emily was changing. "You're disappearing into the past," Lucy said during lunch one day, sitting across from Emily in the school cafeteria. "What about your writing? What about your plans for college? What about your future?" Lucy meant well, but she didn't understand the fire that was burning inside Emily. This search had given Emily something she had lost when her grandfather died, a sense of purpose that made her feel alive again. But Emily felt more connected to her writing than she had in months. She started keeping a detailed journal about Margaret's story, imagining what her ancestors' life might have been like during those scary war years. She wrote about a young woman saying goodbye to her family, not knowing it would be forever. She described Margaret's first day in England, scared and alone, trying to be brave, for the first time since her grandfather's death. Words flowed easily from Emily's pen. The journal grew thicker each day as she filled page after page with Margaret's imagined thoughts and feelings. Writing about the past was helping Emily understand her own present. Then, exactly 3 weeks after her first post, something magical happened. Emily was eating breakfast when her phone buzzed with a notification that made her heart jump. A woman named Patricia from Scotland had shared Emily's photos, adding her own message. "These faces look like my grandmother's family. She used to talk about sisters she lost during the war." Emily's heart raced so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. She messaged Patricia immediately, typing with fingers that trembled with excitement. They exchanged phone numbers and talked for 2 hours that same morning. Patricia's grandmother had told her stories about sisters named Margaret, Catherine, and Jane, who had lived in the same town mentioned in Emily's research. But then Emily's hopes were crushed. Patricia's grandmother had passed away 3 years earlier, and she had never written down the stories or kept any photographs. Patricia didn't know her grandmother's maiden name or exactly where she had lived before coming to Scotland. The connection that had seemed so promising led nowhere. Emily cried for an entire evening, feeling like she had failed Margaret again. But the next morning, she dried her tears and decided not to give up. If Patricia's grandmother had known about the sisters, then other people might know about them too. Emily joined Facebook groups in different languages, posted on genealogy forums across Europe, and even used online translation tools to learn basic phrases in French, German, and Polish, so she could communicate with people who responded to her posts. She created accounts on websites she had never heard of and spent her allowance money on ancestry research subscriptions. Her mother Helen watched this transformation with growing admiration. "You're becoming quite the detective," she said proudly. One evening as Emily worked at the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks and printed photographs. "Your grandfather would be so proud of your determination." Emily was learning something important about herself through this search. She wasn't just looking for Margaret's sisters anymore. She was discovering her own strength, her own determination, and her own ability to keep hope alive even when things seemed impossible. The musty smell of the old album had become comforting now. Every time Emily opened it, she felt like Margaret was sitting right beside her, encouraging her to keep going and never give up. "We're going to find them," Emily whispered to the photographs one quiet evening. "I promise we're going to find them." Emily was eating breakfast on a Tuesday morning when her phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table, spreading jam on her toast and thinking about the history test she had that day. The notification sound made her look down at her phone without much interest. She had been getting messages for weeks now, mostly from people who were curious about her posts but couldn't help with her search. The notification showed a name she didn't recognize, and Fletcher. Emily almost didn't open it. Right away, she had learned not to get her hopes up too high after so many false leads had broken her heart. But something made her click on the message anyway. "Hello, Emily." The message began in neat, careful typing. "I saw your post about the family photos on the genealogy forum. I think one of those women might be my great-grandmother Catherine. She lived in a small town called Millbrook. And she always talked about her sister Margaret, who went to England during the war." Emily nearly dropped her phone right into her bowl of cereal. Her hands started shaking so badly she could barely hold the device steady. With trembling fingers, she scrolled down to see more of the message. There was an attached photo that took a few seconds to load on her phone. When the image appeared, Emily gasped so loudly that her mother Helen looked up from her newspaper with concern. An elderly woman with kind, gentle eyes smiled back at her from the phone screen. The woman was holding a faded black and white photograph that looked exactly identical to one in Margaret's album. The same faces, the same pose, even the same crack in the corner of the picture. "Catherine was my great-grandmother." And the message continued. "She died 5 years ago, but she left behind so many stories about her family. She never stopped hoping that Margaret had survived the war and made it to safety. She used to say that Margaret was the bravest of all the sisters." Emily's heart was beating so fast she thought everyone in the kitchen must be able to hear it. She read the message 3 more times to make sure she wasn't dreaming or misunderstanding something important. This felt too good to be true after months of searching and disappointment. She jumped up from her chair so quickly that it fell over backward with a loud crash. "Mom," she shouted, even though Helen was sitting right across from her. "Mom, I think I found them. I think I actually found Margaret's family." Emily ran upstairs to wake her grandmother Rose, taking the stairs 2 at a time and nearly tripping over the cat in her excitement. She burst into Rose's bedroom without knocking, something she had never done before in her entire life. "Grandmother, look," she cried, showing her the phone with hands that shook like leaves in the wind. "Look what I found. Someone wrote to me about Catherine." Rose sat up slowly in her bed, her grey hair messy from sleep. She put on her reading glasses with careful, arthritic fingers and studied the messages on Emily's phone screen. As she read, tears began flowing down her wrinkled cheeks like small rivers. "Dear heavens," Rose whispered, her voice full of wonder and disbelief. Catherine was Margaret's youngest sister. Margaret talked about her all the time. She used to tell me how Catherine loved to sing and dance, and how she wanted to become a teacher when she grew up. Margaret said Catherine had the most beautiful voice in their whole village. Emily immediately called the phone number and Fletcher had included in her message. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to dial the number 3 times before getting it right. When it answered with a warm Scottish accent, Emily could barely speak through her excitement and tears. The conversation lasted 3 whole hours. Emily sat on her grandmother's bed while Rose listened to every word, sometimes crying and sometimes smiling with joy, and explained that Catherine had indeed become a teacher. Just as she had dreamed, she had married a kind man named David Fletcher and had lived a good life in the small town of Millbrook. She died 5 years ago, and said sadly, and Emily's heart felt heavy for a moment. But she left behind boxes and boxes of letters she had written to refugee organizations. Just like your Margaret did, She never gave up hope that she would find her sister someday. Every year on Margaret's birthday, Catherine would light a candle and sing the songs they used to sing together as children. They arranged a video call that same evening. Emily, Rose, and Helen sat together in the living room, crowded round the laptop computer. When it appeared on the screen, Emily felt like she was looking at a ghost from the past, and had Catherine's gentle eyes and the same warm, crooked smile that Emily recognized from the old photographs in Margaret's album, and was surrounded by her own family members, her children and grandchildren who had all grown up. Hearing stories about the mysterious Sister Margaret who had disappeared during the war, everyone was crying and smiling at the same time. Catherine used to sing us the same lullabies that Margaret sang to her children and revealed, wiping tears from her eyes. She taught us folk songs from their homeland and made traditional recipes she remembered from their childhood. She said the songs were the only way to keep Margaret close to her heart. Rose gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. Margaret did exactly the same things. She sang those same songs to my mother, and my mother sang them to me. I still remember every word, even though I don't know what they mean, as they shared stories late into the night. Emily realized something beautiful and magical was happening. The separation that had lasted over 80 years was finally being healed. 3 months later, Emily stood in the small cemetery in Millbrook, holding Margaret's precious photo album in her hands. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet scent of falling leaves and distant wood smoke from chimneys in the nearby village. But even with all these outdoor smells round her, Emily could still detect the distinctive attic fragrance coming from the old leather cover of the album. The cemetery was peaceful and quiet, with old stone headstones scattered across rolling green hills. Ancient oak trees dropped their golden leaves like confetti, and Emily could hear birds singing softly in the branches above. It felt like the perfect place for such an important moment. And Fletcher stood beside Emily, wearing a warm coat and a gentle smile. Along with him were 12 other newly discovered relatives who had travelled from across England and Scotland for this special gathering. There were cousins Emily had never known existed, elderly aunts with stories to tell, and young children who were just learning about their family history. They had all come to visit Catherine's grave and to celebrate the reunion that Margaret and Catherine had dreamed of their entire lives. Emily's grandmother Rose was there too, leaning on her walking stick but standing proud and tall. Helen had driven them all the way from their town, and she stood with tears of joy in her eyes, watching her daughter fulfill a promise that had taken 8 years to keep. Catherine's grave was marked by a simple grey headstone with her name, and the years of her birth and death carved in neat letters. Someone had placed fresh flowers there recently, and Emily could see that Anne and her family had been taking good care of the resting place. "I brought something special for Catherine," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt down carefully beside the headstone, feeling the damp earth beneath her knees. From a small bag, she pulled out a tiny potted plant with delicate pink flowers. It was a cutting from Margaret's rose garden that Rose had carefully nurtured for decades, waiting for the right moment to plant it. Margaret always said that Catherine loved roses more than any other flower, Rose whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. She used to tell me how Catherine would pick wild roses and put them in her hair when she was young. Margaret planted roses in every garden she ever had, hoping that someday Catherine might smell them and know that Margaret was thinking of her. Emily dug a small hole in the soft earth beside the headstone and gently placed the rose cutting into the ground. She packed the soil round it with her hands, feeling like she was planting hope itself. The little plant looked brave and strong, ready to grow and bloom for many years to come. Then Emily opened the photo album one final time. showing Catherine's grave the pictures that had started this incredible journey months ago. She held the album open so that the faces of Margaret, Catherine, Helen, and Jane could look down at the headstone. The musty attic smell seemed different now, not sad and forgotten anymore, but rich with stories finally being told and love finally being shared. Dot and had brought her own surprise for this special day. From her leather purse, she pulled out a small, handwritten book with a blue cover. The pages were yellowed with age and filled with Catherine's careful handwriting in faded ink. Catherine wrote down every single memory she had of Margaret, and explained, holding the book like it was made of gold, every story from their childhood, every song they used to sing together, every recipe their mother taught them. She spent years writing it all down because she wanted to make sure nothing was forgotten, even if she never found Margaret again. They spent the entire afternoon sitting on benches near Catherine's grave, sharing these precious stories and comparing them with the stories that Margaret had passed down to her own family. It was amazing to discover how similar their families had become despite being separated for so long. Both sides had kept the same traditions alive, sung the same lullabies to their children, and passed down the same values of kindness, determination, and never giving up hope. Emily realized something wonderful as she listened to all these stories. The musty smell on the album hadn't been the scent of sadness after all. It had been the fragrance of love preserved through decades of waiting, hope kept alive in darkness, and faith that someday, somehow, family would find its way back together again. As the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky shades of orange and pink, Emily stood up and made an announcement to everyone gathered round Catherine's grave. "I'm going to write their story," she said with determination in her voice. "Margaret's and Catherine's story. I'm going to write it down so that everyone can read it. And I'm going to make sure it reaches other families who are still searching for their lost relatives 6 months later." Emily's book, The Album That Smelled Like Hope, was published and became a bestseller. More importantly in the sales, it helped reconnect dozens of other families who had been separated by war and time. Emily received letters from people all over the world who had found their own lost relatives after reading about Margaret and Catherine's story. Emily kept Margaret's photo album on her writing desk while she worked on the book. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the house was peaceful, she would open it and breathe in that special attic smell. But now it reminded her that no dream is ever truly lost, no hope is ever wasted, and love always finds a way to bring people home. Margaret and Catherine's story had finally ended the way it was meant to end. But Emily's story was just beginning. The end